As many of you know, the Arizona State Museum is part of the University of Arizona, located in Tucson. We are situated on land that has been stewarded by and home to Indigenous peoples for 13,000 years. Today, the Tucson area is home to the O'odham and the Pasquayaqui, and there are 22 federally recognized tribes with reservation lands in the state of Arizona. The museum's collections and research focus on the indigenous peoples of the Southwest and Northwest Mexico, and we present programs exploring the history and cultures of this region. This year's Zoom talks are in association with our exhibit Wrapped in Color, Legacies of the Mexican Sarape. Now, I'm happy to welcome my colleague, Dr. Michael Brescia. In addition to being curator of ethnohistory at the Arizona State Museum, he holds faculty affiliations in the Department of History and the James E. Rogers College of Law here at the University of Arizona. He teaches a wide range of courses, including Mexican history, borderlands history, and comparative history of North America. At the Arizona State Museum, Dr. Brescia was lead curator for an exhibit titled Many Mexicos, Vistas de la Frontera, which the American Association for State and Local History awarded a Leadership in History Award of Merit in 2012. Dr. Brescia is the co-author of 2 books that examine the broader historical forces that have shaped our continent since pre-Columbian times to the present. Tonight, his talk focuses on the nearly 1,600-mile Camino Real del Tierra Adentro, looking specifically at material culture and identities that emerged as a result of exchanges between Europeans and indigenous societies. And so now it's my pleasure to give to you Dr. Michael Brescia.
Well, good evening, everyone, our cherished members of the Arizona State Museum and all of our friends out there in Zoom land. I'm delighted to support my colleague, Lisa Falk, and our Community Engagement Division by sharing with you my passion for all things Mexican and Southwestern. If you haven't yet done so, I encourage you to come down and visit us at Arizona State Museum. We've been open to the public now for some time after the pandemic subsided and then picked up again and then went back and all these variants, but we have been open to the public and now we're open on Saturdays. So come on down and walk through and admire the Wrapped in Color exhibit in particular. There you will find a remarkably striking display of Mexican history and culture manifested in the sarape, the sarapito, the saltillo, or the cloth, shawl, or blanket that's used as clothing. Not surprisingly, my lecture tonight examines the ebb and flow of people's goods, ideas, and identities, the intersection of material culture and identity along a historical road, an old highway of sorts that has been recognized by UNESCO as part and parcel of a shared cultural heritage that at the end of the day does not recognize human-made borders or boundaries. Finally, I want to give a sincere shout out to Darlene Lizarraga, the hardest working member of the ASM family, for her support of my public outreach initiatives. So again, thank you, Darlene. Thank you, Lisa, and my colleagues in the Community Engagement Division. El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the Royal Road, sometimes called the King's Road of the interior lands, is one of the longest, oldest, and most historic roads, not just in North America, but in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas. It was built along Native American footpaths and trails. It became a primary transportation corridor for the Spanish colonies. It linked what we call today the American West with the new nation of Mexico in the 19th century, and continues to be a thriving international highway of sorts with commerce, culture, and people. Within the United States, it is officially known as the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro National Historic Trail. And again, within the United States, you can see there on the map, it runs more than 400 miles through New Mexico and Western Texas. From the border, the international border, the twin cities of El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, it extends another 1,100 miles into the heart of Mexico. During the Spanish colonial period, it connected Mexico City with the northern frontier capital of New Mexico, Santa Fe. And of course, along the way, it connected mining communities, ranches, haciendas, military forts, and the different indigenous pueblos. Native Americans, Spanish conquistadors, soldiers, missionaries, merchants, and settlers have traveled its great length over time. Very briefly about origins, increases, as you know, I'm not an archaeologist, but I'm surrounded by them at the Arizona State Museum, so they can address this particular issue with greater detail and greater care. But in a general way, I can say that increases in human settlement along the upper Rio Grande in central and northern New Mexico took place roughly between 1250 and 1450 CE or AD. Archaeologists used to call this time period the Proto-Historical Period in the Southwest, and some of them still use that word. It does get expanded, though, to the 1540s. The original inhabitants along the Rio Grande established pueblos and extensive trade routes to neighboring peoples in the east, south, and west. For approximately 2 centuries, Native American trade connected the pueblos on and near the Rio Grande, and consequently, many trails were traveled and marked. In the mid-16th century, in other words, in the mid-1500s, newcomers, strangers, if you will, newcomers from the south appeared in Pueblo country along the Rio Grande when Spaniards and their indigenous allies from central Mexico, led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, explored present-day New Mexico and lands to the east in the Great Plains. And if you've been following the local news recently, there's also adding in southeastern Arizona. The Coronado expedition of 1540 to 1542 anticipated the first serious colonization efforts of New Spain, because that's what Mexico was called, New Spain's far northern frontier, well beyond the line of mining settlements by the mid-16th century. And by 1580, Spanish settlements have been established about 850 miles north of Mexico City. The richest mining centers were connected by a well-traveled road, which would ultimately be extended to beyond Santa Fe, New Mexico, and even connect what Spaniards called San Juan Pueblo, or the indigenous community of Oque-Wingue. That's how they preferred to identify themselves. This route would later become known as the Royal Road of the Interior Lands, El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. In the late 16th century, the road linked Mexico City, you see Mexico City on your map there, in the heart of Mexico, with various towns along the way, and you see all of them listed on the map: Guanajuato, Lagos, Aguascalientes, Zacatecas, Durango, El Parral, Chihuahua, Juarez. All those towns were connected. To better appreciate the broader context of the Camino Real, it's crucial for us to examine the concept of 4 moving frontiers that brought people, merchandise, ideas, and new dietary regimes to Mexico's northern frontier, part of which would become, in the mid-19th century, the American West. Put more succinctly, these 4 moving frontiers, when taken together, gave birth to and sustained the Camino Real. The first frontier, the mining frontier. For those of you who've gone on some of my learning expeditions or attended some of my master classes, you know one of my favorite quotes to talk about Spanish mining in Mexico comes from Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, when he met the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma in 1519. His famous words to Moctezuma we Spaniards have a disease of the heart, and that disease could only be cured with gold. Ultimately, as we know, Spaniards found some gold in Mexico, but it was a lot of silver that would fuel expansion outside of central Mexico. So the first moving frontier that pushed Spaniards and their indigenous allies out of central Mexico was in the search of precious metals and minerals, of silver. So it took them to Zacatecas and Durango and Chihuahua, all over the northern frontier. What was the ideological basis, right? What was the philosophical basis of the mining frontier? Two early modern economic concepts coming out of Europe at the time: mercantilism and Bullionism. Bullionism was the economic philosophy that said a nation's wealth was measured by the quantity of minerals and precious metals and stones that they possessed. Mercantilism, of course, with the advent of colonies, was the mother country would enrich itself through commerce and exploitation of natural resources of its overseas colony. So what happens? The mining frontier leads to Spaniards and native peoples leaving central Mexico and moving north, looking for gold and silver. Well, along the way, they encounter a lot of indigenous peoples who are then brought into the Spanish orbit, the larger Hispanic imperial world. And we see increases in population, movements of people. Well, who's going to feed them? Who's going to feed the miners and their indigenous laborers? There was a need for farms and ranches. And that leads to an agrarian and ranching frontier and the search for reliable water sources. One of the things that Spaniards introduced in terms of material culture was the acequia, or the zanja. These were ditches dug, of course, to connect the Rio Grande and to make sort of lateral tributaries in order to irrigate crops. So an acequia culture developed, Spaniards brought along with them. A third frontier, the missionary frontier. Why the missionary frontier? Well, on the heels of the mining frontier and an agrarian, agricultural, ranching frontier, you now have a growing and more complex population. Spanish miners and farmers and ranchers, irrigators, sedentary indigenous population, nomadic indigenous tribes that Spain tried to make sedentary, to live in settlements. The Spanish crown had an obligation to convert native peoples. To do that, you need to introduce the missionary arm of the Catholic Church to promote and defend the faith and minister to the spiritual needs, not only of Spaniards, but to evangelize and convert native peoples. So that would lead to the establishment of missions along the Camino Real, but also expanding westward and eastward as they went north. And then finally, all three of those frontier mines, ranches, farms, and missions needed protection. So all three of these moving frontiers required protection. Protection from whom? Well, two elements, two forces: more mobile indigenous peoples, such as the Apaches, the Comanches, and the Utes, who were hostile to Spanish colonialism. But Spain also had geopolitical concerns. Britain, France, Russia, and eventually a young United States. Also a series of Native American rebellions against Spanish rule. The famous Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is just one that comes to mind. But also France taking over Louisiana. And then, of course, eventually it went back and went to Spain, and then France again, and eventually Napoleon sells it to Thomas Jefferson in 1803. You also have Spain and Florida being sold to the United States. Russia coming down the northwestern coast of the continent. All of those things taken together led to a military frontier, to the establishment of presidios, our military garrisons, up and down the Camino Real, but also across the far expanse of the northern frontier of New Spain. All four moving frontiers contained peoples and communities that became competitors for natural resources, such as water and pasture on this far northern frontier. After so many successes at finding new veins of silver in places like Zacatecas in north central Mexico or Santa Barbara in Chihuahua, it should come as no surprise that Spaniards wanted to go further north and realize settlements in the upper Rio Grande Valley of northern New Mexico, which Coronado didn't do in the 1540s. And that's what Juan de Oñate accomplished in late 1597 when he and his entourage left Santa Barbara, Chihuahua, to finish their trek to the area that we call today Santa Fe and the Oque Owinge Pueblo, but again, back then it was known as San Juan Pueblo. This entourage of Oñates brought with them material culture that ranged from agricultural and ranching implements like the plow, the saddle, stirrups, iron axes, but it also included expressions of devotion, of Catholicism, such as statues, which would ultimately facilitate the Santos tradition, making those bultos, those Catholic saints, but bringing rosary beads, prayer cards, all of those things went up the Camino Real to northern New Mexico. The Camino Real de Tierra Adentro is a classic example of a trade route that combined land and maritime transport to touch many cultures around the globe. The road's 1,600-mile span in North America linked to an intercontinental network of roads and sea routes that enable the cultural and economic coalescing of indigenous peoples of North America with Europeans, Africans, and other indigenous peoples coming from central and north central Mexico. For this reason, some scholars refer to the road as Camino Real Intercontinental, or the Intercontinental Royal Road. Now, with regard to that trail, that road, one must think of the route in general terms. Unlike the modern highways in the United States and Mexico, although hopefully the new infrastructure bill that was passed will do a lot to improve some of our roads here in the United States, but unlike the modern transportation system, the highway system, both in the United States and Mexico, the Camino Real differed in that it was not a unified single entity. Rather, caravans along the route responded to local conditions to avoid washed out riverbeds, known as arroyos, overgrazed ranges, marshes, deep sands, steep slopes, generally difficult terrain. The Camino Real, therefore, featured many stretches of well-traveled segments that departed from the main route and merged with the trail after avoiding some unfavorable terrain. In fact, if you look at the slide there, the map in the middle, you notice at the top of that map, the Camino Real hugs the Rio Grande. And then all of a sudden it departs. Well, remember your old math from high school and college, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So to get them down to number 10 on the map, they decided not to hug the river and of course have to straddle the river in the mountain range. They cut through what was known as the Journey of Death, because this was very harsh land. And you were, of course, subject to attack by more mobile, nomadic indigenous peoples. Similarly, very few portions of the Camino Real were paved, and those stretches existed only in larger settlements. Certainly, the trail, the road, wound its way across great expanses of open country with natural features as landmarks to mark the route across some very arid regions. Particularly the Chihuahuan Desert. Throughout the late 17th and 18th centuries, Spanish settlers continued to arrive in New Mexico and traveled along the Camino Real in both directions, accelerated. Despite tense relations between indigenous peoples and Spaniards, and I mentioned the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, Well, 12 years later in 1692, Diego de Vargas leads a reconquest of northern New Mexico. As the 18th century unfolded, caravans traveled north from Mexico, and many new parajes were established by caravan leaders along the Camino Real. Paraje, still a word used in Spanish, a rest stop or an encampment. And if you look on the upper left-hand corner of the slide, there is a paraje that's marked off as Fray Cristobal. And both the federal government and the state of New Mexico provide funds in order to set up markers for these parajes. Again, these were rest stops or encampments along the way. And a lot of the numbers that you see on this map were parajes. These parajes, these campgrounds, marked the stopping points of a day's travel and were frequently used each year. And they became significant components along the route. Now, as a historian, I also want to stress the significance of understanding the Camino Real beyond whether or not it was a paved road or a rocky and dusty trail with rest stops along the way. The Camino Real's full significance cannot be properly understood without the context of its global network of economic interdependence and cultural exchange over several centuries. What do I mean? Spain's ability to connect such far-reaching local and global landscapes is rooted in its unique history of caminos reales, or royal roads. Various caminos radiated from Madrid, which would ultimately become the capital of Spain in the 16th, 17th centuries, including a 16th century route that connected Madrid to Oviedo. You see there on the map on the upper right-hand corner, Oviedo's in the northern part of the area known as Asturias, northern Spain. So there were roads that connected Madrid to León, which you see on the map, but also Oviedo, which is right above that on the Cantabrian Sea. With the Spanish, and there was another route that was very popular in Spain and still today is a spiritual pilgrimage, the Camino de Santiago, or the Way of Santiago, the apostle that went to Spain and brought Christianity to Spain according to spiritual belief and faith. And you see the yellow road there, that's one of the routes that connected people from France to Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, northern Spain. But also you see the blue route up there that cuts through the Basque Country, Bilbao, and also in Asturias, Oviedo, and then it becomes a green line. That was also a Camino. So Spain had a tradition of Caminos. Now, with the Spanish colonization of the Western Hemisphere, a new network of Caminos developed from Mexico to Peru. Among these were pre-Columbian roads that remained in use after the arrival of the Spaniards. A main section of the Inca Road in South America, that's the map on the lower right-hand side of the slide, between Quito and Mendoza in the Peruvian Andes. When Spain came, it went from a royal Inca road to a royal Spanish road. The pre-Hispanic trail that followed the Rio Grande north through New Mexico, in which had linked the region's pueblos to other indigenous communities in north central Mexico, other trading centers, and also Western Mexico, since at least the 13th century, also now became part of the Camino Real system. In Mexico, the overland section of Camino Real featured 4 major caminos that were designed to converge and diverge from the viceregal capital of Mexico City. And you see the one map there on the left shows you all the connections between Mexico City and the various places, parajes, cities, towns, mining centers, going all the way up. And eventually the Camino Real would have sort of an informal connection to Taos. If you ever traveled, I think it's State Highway 68, there's an old road to Taos that you can take, very scenic and very hilly. But the point is that 4 other major caminos came about, designed to converge and diverge from the capital city, Mexico City. The earliest road, the first one, connected from the east coast of Veracruz to Mexico City. That is the old map you see on the right, when, in fact, Cortez founded the city of Veracruz as one way to justify him illegally leaving Cuba to start this exploration of the mainland. And you see the green line there, that becomes a royal road connecting that port town of Veracruz that he founded in 1519 to eventually Mexico City. Another royal road moved from Veracruz to Mexico City. A second one moved from Acapulco on the west coast, and that would lead from Mexico City to Acapulco. As you know, it's still around today. It's a resort town. And then from Acapulco, a sea route, a maritime route connected Mexico's mainland to Asia. So Asia also plays a role, a maritime route to the Philippine Islands, and then that opens up to China and Japan, brings in North America, brings in the Camino Real, and globalizes its significance. I'm just looking at my notes here. I wanted to make sure that I got all the roads here. So east coast of Veracruz to Mexico City. Another one moved from Acapulco on the west coast, and that led to sea routes that connected Mexico's overland routes to the Spanish colonies. Mexico City's Camino to the port of Veracruz on the Gulf Coast, again, that old map that you see on the right, he founded that town to justify what he did leaving Cuba. But in the long run of Spanish colonialism, that route connected North America to Europe, specifically the port cities of Cadiz and Sevilla in southern Spain. Likewise, Mexico City's Camino to Acapulco on the Pacific coast supported the Asian trade. And again, as I mentioned, this was the fabled Manila galleons, where they departed and arrived from Asia. So if you look at the map there, these global maritime trade routes, all of those were in support of the Camino Real, but pay attention to the white arrows, the white shipping lanes, because that shows leaving Seville, crossing the Atlantic, first stopping in Havana, Cuba, and then making their way to Veracruz. European merchandise and African merchandise would be unloaded there in Veracruz, and then the Camino route would be taken overland to Mexico City. And then sometime from Mexico City, those products would be brought to Acapulco. Meanwhile, you see the maps over on the Pacific Ocean, the arrow, I should say, on the Pacific Ocean. Treasure ships from the Philippine Islands, from Manila, would arrive in Acapulco, and there would be an exchange going on. So the Acapulco ships would unload the Asian merchandise, take on board the European, Mexican, and African merchandise, and there you have this very global network. There was also a third Camino that went south from Mexico City through the large and ethnically diverse lands of Oaxaca to Guatemala. A fourth ambitious Camino, originally known as the Camino de la Plata, or the Silver Road, moved silver from Zacatecas and other mines to Mexico City. And eventually it's that Camino de la Plata. It's the Silver Road that would then be extended all the way up to Santa Fe, New Mexico. With the 1598 colonization of New Mexico, well, the European colonization of New Mexico, the route was extended, and that's why we know it as the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. It was the main transportation route connecting Mexico City to the interior lands of northern New Spain. Commercially, the Caminos allowed for increased exports of ore to Spain, the minting of large amounts of currency, and massive stocks of trade goods that were bought and sold. This, in turn, generated unprecedented growth in international trade. Spain, which enforced major restrictions along the Camino Real, was a beneficiary in this new world economy, but only to a point, because Spain owed so much money to its European creditors because it waged wars during the era of the Reformation in the 16th century going into the early 17th century, that it was constantly in debt to bankers and financiers in the Low Countries, in like Amsterdam, what is now the Netherlands, and of course London, but also Parisian and Venetian bankers and financiers. So a lot of the money, a lot of this global wealth never really stayed in the mother country. It was Spain had to use to pay off debts. In time, though, even such far-flung Spanish colonies as New Mexico benefited from the intercontinental flow of goods. In 1803 and 1804, a German scientist traveled to New Spain, Alexander von Humboldt, and he noted the major commercial importance of Mexico's Camino network. And he specifically mentioned that route of silver, the Camino de la Plata, the silver route, as among the region's local routes with global importance. Indeed, New Mexicans who lived along El Camino Real's local roadways were afforded access to such European luxury goods as wine, chocolate, olives, and nuts. Prized Asian goods, including porcelain, silk, and spices, also moved up the Camino Real. In the archives in Santa Fe, for example, just to give you a little bit of a documentary flavor of this, we have a last will and testament dated 1762 of Juana Lujan. And in her last will, she lists items imported from France and China. We have a will from 1815. It's also a last will and testament, but also an inventory of goods of a leading Santa Fe resident who also was a captain in the militia, Manuel Delgado. And his inventory included imported Mexican textiles from North Central or Central Mexico, but also Chinese porcelain and ceramics among his personal items. Captain Delgado, 13 velvet, cashmere, and silk suits had either been imported from Mexico, ready to wear, or were made from imported Mexican, Spanish, or Asian cloth. Now, on the negative side, there is a biological consequence that I'll just mention very briefly here of the Camino Real. As a major transportation network, it carried a host of European diseases along the way, including up into northern New Mexico. Smallpox and measles and respiratory illnesses were unknown to local indigenous peoples before the establishment of the Camino Real. By the 17th century, so-called old world diseases had contributed to a steep decline in the population of New Mexico's indigenous peoples. However, over time, as the general population increased and the native population in particular sort of healed and leveled off and began, not like a slight increase, particularly in the 19th century, but kind of at least leveled off. There wasn't as much death going on. As the general population increased overall along the Rio Grande, the need for goods and supplies from beyond the northern frontier similarly increased, which resulted in a well-organized trade system throughout the century. In the early decades of the 19th century, in other words, in the early 1800s, trade along the Camino Real was bolstered when merchants from Missouri began shipping goods from the United States into Mexico along the Santa Fe Trail. The opening of the Santa Fe Trail from Missouri to Santa Fe, followed by the old Spanish Trail from Santa Fe into the major seaports of California like Los Angeles, extended the reach of El Camino Real and brought new cultural forces flowing into New Mexico from the eastern and western United States. These links further expanded intercontinental trade on the Camino Real as U.S. goods were moved to such previously inaccessible destinations in Mexico, Europe, Manila, Cuba, and the Caribbean. In short, from the early 1820s through the mid-1840s, overland trade between the two nations was extensive. And the significance of this commercial enterprise was evident in the overall length of this international trade route that connected markets from Missouri to Mexico City. When Mexico struck out on its own, when it received its independence, fought for its independence, earned its independence from Spain in 1821, the Royal Road went through a name change. It was now known as the Camino Nacional, the National Road, to reflect Mexico's rejection of Spanish colonialism. This new era of the trail's existence was short-lived, however, because in 1846, when the United States invaded Mexico, the Camino Nacional served as the invasion route for the American military, entering New Mexico, bound for El Paso, then Chihuahua City, making its way all the way down to Mexico City. With the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ended the US invasion and occupation of Mexico, Mexico lost an extensive amount of its northern frontier to the United States. Shortly thereafter, the United States Department of War authorized the establishment of military posts in the newly designated 9th Military District, which encompassed the newly created territory of New Mexico. During this period, the settlements near El Paso were aligned within New Mexico's jurisdiction, and the length of the former Royal Road remained in active use to supply military outposts throughout the territory. The twilight of the trail's use occurred in the late 1870s and early 1880s, but with the advent of the railroads into New Mexico at the beginning of the 1880s, travel along the trail gradually decreased. So, with the arrival of the railroad in the 1880s, Camino Real was abandoned as the primary avenue for long-distance transport. Although the trail's intercontinental pathways served and indelibly shaped the cultural heritage of Mexico, New Mexico, and West Texas, its international legacy faded away until the late 20th century, with a renewed emphasis on cultural heritage, cultural patrimony. All of that was given historical importance, especially by two groups, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and ICOMOS, or the International Council on Monuments and Sites. These two leading organizations helped develop systems to document and preserve World Heritage sites. In 2000, when the United States Congress designated the 400-mile US portion of the Camino Real in New Mexico and West Texas as a National Historic Trail, it encouraged collaboration between the US and Mexican governments to enhance the Camino Real's valuable historical and cultural assets on both sides of the border. Today, the National Park Service and Bureau of Land Management, which jointly administer the US portion of the trail, collaborate and partner with INA, the Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, or Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, as well as other Mexican agencies, to create best practices for trail protection, to provide technical assistance, and develop complementary preservation and education programs that increase public awareness. Now, in Mexico, our neighbor and friend to the south, the Camino Real was officially added to UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites in 2010. The designation includes 55 sites and 5 existing World Heritage places that cut through 9 Mexican states and the federal capital, Mexico City, and encompasses 870 miles of that 1,600-mile Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. The sites consist, and I have the numbers listed there on the slide, of 11 historic downtown areas, 9 towns, 7 former haciendas, 7 churches, chapels and bridges, 4 stretches of road, 2 colonial schools, caves, a mine, a convent, a hospital, and a cemetery. What you see on the photographs there on the right, the image on top is the bridge, the Puente de Ojuelos, or the Bridge of Ojuelos in the state of Jalisco, so Western Mexico. That was considered sort of a branch shoot of the Camino Real. And then the church you see on the bottom actually is the Plaza of San Francisco in the town of Sombrerete, Zacatecas. And that you see is not only a plaza, but it's also a church and a convent where the missionaries lived. Although the image, it's a pretty good photograph, but you really don't see the pink quarry. And that reflects the influence of indigenous peoples from Tlaxcala, from central Mexico, who accompanied Spaniards up the Camino Real to Zacatecas, and they helped, and they brought with them a lot of their stone techniques and also the pink quarry from Tlaxcala and brought up here to Zacatecas. So you see there's a lot of different, that 870-mile segment contains a lot of different features, buildings and schools and bridges, etc. The cultural expression of Spaniards, of indigenous peoples, mestizos, which were the biological and cultural blending of Spanish and Native American, of Africans, of the interaction between Africans and Native peoples and Africans and Spaniards. All of that is evident up and down the Camino Real because particularly indigenous peoples and Africans are being brought up to work in the mines, for example, to help build these bridges and to build the temples or the churches, the missions, all of the different material structures that were needed to support and sustain Spanish colonialism. The use of the Camino was intense, and that's just evidenced by all of the different missions and chapels and convents and hospitals, strongholds and houses that were built. So if you go online, you can actually find an itemized list that Mexico submitted to UNESCO that nicely details each of those 55 places in the 5 existing World Heritage Sites. So in effect, the Camino Real is a network of cultural, social, ethnic, scientific, economic, biological, architectural, and artistic experiences. The communities along the Camino Real, within Mexico, but also beyond its frontier, have material, cultural, and spiritual values that have been preserved as a rich and varied inheritance, responsible for promoting development and extending bridges to other cultures. In fact, I think you could make an argument that that is the larger goal of UNESCO and its World Heritage sites, to demonstrate the universality of the human condition, that culture is shared, that it doesn't just belong within one set of ethnic borders or national borders. Language and traditions, built heritage, libraries and archives, painting and music, architecture, landscaping. The fusions of all cultures come together in these World Heritage Sites, and the Camino Real is a great example of that. Now, back in the United States, though, despite the successful designation of the Camino Real as a National Historic Trail in the year 2000, not every official effort to commemorate the so-called King's Highway bore fruit. 25 miles south of the small town of Socorro, New Mexico, seemed like a perfect place for the state of New Mexico to dedicate a new museum to the history of the Royal Road. And it was named the Camino Real Heritage Center. You can see a bit there on the right-hand photograph. This was a multi-million-dollar government project that may go down as one of the state's most expensive blunders. No one really remembers exactly where the idea came from, but you first find reference of it in 1999, embedded in an obscure amendment that made its way on the state Senate floor. there was an appropriation of $1 million to plan, design, construct, and equip this new Camino Real Heritage Center in Socorro County. The federal government joined the effort, particularly the U.S. Bureau of Land Management, and they threw in another $4 million. And by 2005, New Mexico's newest museum became a reality. And an estimated crowd of over 2,000 people attended the dedication ceremony in 2005, over 2,000 people. Well, 11 years later, in 2016, New Mexico closed it down. What had happened? Well, as real estate agents always like to say, location, location, location. The consulting firm that was hired by the state government to explore this heritage center said the best place for this museum would be a spot 25 miles south of the small town of Socorro and nearly 5 miles off of Interstate 25. Even though there are no gas stations, hotels, or restaurants nearby, this consulting firm estimated it would draw, on average, 106,000 visitors a year, boost the economy by some $10 million, and create 174 jobs, let alone the number of short-term employment opportunities tied to its construction. Over the course of a decade, according to the records, the museum never reached 8,000 tourists a year. I think the most it ever got was 7,800 tourists. The remote location meant few visitors, little income, deficient utilities, inadequate staffing, and expensive maintenance. The politicians, once the writing was on the wall that this was not sustainable, of course, the critiques came out. One state senator said, "I think the obituary was written many, many years ago on that one. It was fairly bizarre that they would place it where it was because there was no way you could really justify that location in my mind." Another, the former Speaker of the State House, he did say it's a beautiful building. It had some really compelling exhibits, great material culture on display, engaging interpretation, but it's in the middle of nowhere. They built the museum in the wrong place. I have to admit, ladies and gentlemen, I do a lot of research up in northern New Mexico, and all my trips there, I never took the detour off the exit to go visit the Camino Real Heritage Center. I'm almost embarrassed to say it as a historian. It was on the list, but because of its location and the time constraints and financial constraint, how do I make the detour? How long do I stay? I got to get to the archive, do my research. I got to get back to ASM. It's never happened. Finally, I will wrap up the lecture today by briefly looking at some of the material culture that was brought up the Camino Real. Historians and anthropologists often talk about three fundamental categories of material culture: dwellings, such as a home, a store, a temple, and what's inside each of those dwellings. Another fundamental category, fashion, such as clothing and jewelry, and religious iconography. Those are sort of the three fundamental categories. And real briefly here, so this is an example of a dwelling. This is a house located along the route of the Camino Real in Zacatecas, in the city of Zacatecas. This is just an example. I just wanted to show you the idea of a fundamental category. That house had to be built, and it was built during the late colonial period as a way for a place for people to live. This was in the city. It was mainly occupied, we can assume, of course, by Spaniards living in the core of that city center. Over time, Spaniards moved out, and we can say perhaps mestizos moved in. We can make some fundamental guesses of who owned that, but that's an example of a fundamental category of material culture. This is the Costas painting, a Costa painting, not the Costa painting. There are many of them. This dates to the 18th century. Its artist is anonymous. The State Museum had a great exhibit sorting out race. We had a section devoted to the Costas paintings. But if you look just real quick there, that very first image on the upper left-hand corner, Español con India, comma, followed mestizo. a mathematical equation that reflected Spanish social and legal understandings of race. So a Spaniard, a male Spaniard with a female Indian produced a mestizo. So there's a cultural and racial component to New Spain, to colonial Mexico, and those ideas of mestizaje, the cultural and biological blending of the races, is brought up the Camino Real as Spaniards and native peoples and Africans intermingled with each other. But I also put the slide up there to show you fashion, what people were wearing, indigenous dress, European dress. Those concepts of fashion make their way up to the northern frontier along the Camino Real. And another fundamental category I mentioned was religious iconography. On the left, you have, well, both of them are retablos, these images painted on wood or tin that expressed a Hispanic Catholicism linked to asking for favors, heavenly favors. You might paint on a tin to request something from a saint, or if your prayers were answered, you might paint on wood or tin as an expression of gratitude. On the far left is a retablo from Zacatecas, from the mining city of Zacatecas in north central Mexico. This comes from the late 18th, early 19th century, of Santo Niño de Atocha, the holy child of Atocha, baby Jesus, if you will. Well, miners, the migration of folks, both Spanish and indigenous, from Zacatecas, making their way up the Camino Real. In other words, migration of peoples brought it to New Mexico. So what you see on the right is a retablo of Santo Niño de Atocha in the late 18th century, early 19th century retablo of Santo Niño. Again, the ebb and flow of cultural ideas and people along the Camino Real. So again, those are reflections of the three fundamental categories. Fundamental meaning in a broad sense. What are some three specific examples of these categories? And there you see on your slide, examples of material culture, works of art, food and its preparation, and domestic items. So in terms of food and its preparation, on the slide there, the three photographs, the one on the upper right-hand corner is the molinillo, right? The way to make the froth chocolate. And chocolate was native to Mexico, indigenous to Mexico. Cacao beans were currency in the Aztec Empire. Spaniards fell in love with chocolate, particularly when they added old world sugar to it to sweeten it. Well, in order to get that froth, you need to have an instrument. So those instruments, those molinillos, make their way up the Camino Real and find their way into places like Chihuahua, Texas, New Mexico. In fact, the Arizona State Museum has examples of molinillos in its collection. Another example of food and its preparation would be the Calavera, the ceramic pieces, and there's the Calavera that you see in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, the photographs, I should say. That is also comes from the Arizona State Museum collection. So here is an expression of Spanish, indigenous, and Asian artistic styles that come together into pots, into bowls, what are known as bahillas, or dinnerware, crockery, that were made in central Mexico, and those material culture are kept within families, passed on generations, and then make their way up the Camino Real. Domestic items might include baúl or baúles, the plural, trunks. And you see an image there of a trunk that made its way up the Camino Real and found its way to New Mexico. The Amarin Foundation in Dragoon in southeastern Arizona has some good collection, at least two, I believe, of baúles that I've seen, trunks. This is where folks stored their clothes, their fashion. They put jewelry, they put personal items. Maybe those last wills and testaments that I talked about would make their way into the baúl as protection. So we have examples of food and preparations, domestic items. I mentioned the works of art, the retablos. All of these come together and be part of material culture and identity. It's a mixed identity. It's not just one identity set in stone. It's fluid. It changes over time as Spaniards, indigenous peoples, Africans intermingled, work together, and move their way up the far northern, up the Camino Real to the far northern frontier. I'll end my presentation this evening, ladies and gentlemen, by extending once again my invite to come on down to visit the Arizona State Museum and see that remarkably striking wrapped in color exhibit. If you want to see the quintessential example of materials, techniques, peoples, and cultures that made their way north up the Camino Real, the wrapped in color exhibit provides the visitor with a compelling and engaging story of how the social and cultural identities manifest themselves in textiles, in effect, manifest themselves in material culture. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention tonight and for your patience. I know we're getting close to 7 o'clock. I'm open for any questions you might have. And as I always do, I invite the audience to share any experiences they might have on up and down the Camino Real, experiences that might be distinct from my own. So questions you might have or comments you'd like to make or observations you'd like to share. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, Michael. That was really interesting. And 2,000 miles and a bunch of history along those miles. Yes. Right. But we have some questions. One that I want to start with, and then I'm going to ask one of my own. But somebody was asking how much of the physical surface of the Camino Real is there today? How much of it could somebody follow? Do you know? That's
a good question. I don't. There are certainly markers in the United States, but even in Mexico, and a lot of the major Mexican highway system too, either straddle or follow the Camino Real. But that's a very, I don't know. I know there are some markers, but I don't know exactly how much of it you can actually follow. Certainly on foot and car would be more likely. But that's a very good question. It's something I'm going to have to look into.
And then I have one related to our Wrapped in Color exhibit. I was looking at your maps of the Camino Real and all the different connections, and you were mentioning the port at Veracruz. And I know that the Saltillo Serape received its name not because they were all made in Saltillo, but because of the major trade market in Saltillo, which sent them off into Europe and the rest of the world. But I didn't see a port near Saltillo in the Gulf of Mexico. Would they have gone down to Veracruz to ship them out?
Yeah, Veracruz was the primary port on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And Spain was very strict in trying to funnel all of the trade coming from Europe into the port of Veracruz. So yeah, and then whatever was there in Veracruz would then be shipped over land on the Camino Real to Mexico City. And then from there it would either go north up the Camino Real, the Silver Road, all the way up to New Mexico, or it would continue on to Acapulco, go to the West Coast, the Pacific Ocean area, and then send products to Asia. Well, by the way,
and the Asian products would come in through Acapulco to
That's
Mexico
right,
City.
exactly.
Right.
Well,
let me get to the questions in the Q&A. So you mentioned the chocolate and the molero, and so one person was wondering if the Spanish used this route, if they trade, if they said, as chocolate is an indigenous American product, was it appropriate by the Spanish and then traded in a different form along this route, like by adding sugar or in bars, or how had it been used before the Spanish came, and then how did the Spanish?
Well, like I mentioned, under the Aztecs, cacao beans were a form of currency, and in fact, the Aztec emperor would demand a portion of the tribute payments that subjugated communities would have to give him. So we have some wonderful codices that actually show images of the cacao beans as tribute payments to the Aztec emperor. Now, within Aztec society, chocolate was a drink often reserved for the elite. When Spaniards came, they thought it was a little too bitter, so that's why they added sugar. Over time, chocolate use sort of seems to have fallen out among indigenous peoples, but Spaniards embraced it like crazy, and so did the missionaries. There's a great anecdote, a great story about the missionary in what is now Yuma, Arizona, right? That point by the California border with Mexico and Arizona, where the indigenous peoples are rebelling against Spanish colonialism. They go to the missionary's house, Father Garces, that was the missionary's last name, Garces. They demand that he leaves his little thatched dwelling to come out to be martyred. They're going to kill him. And he peeks his head out the door and says, "Let me finish my chocolate first." And that's
a wise man.
That made it into the historical record. So I love that story. But chocolate was definitely it became part and parcel of the Spanish sweet tooth. And like you said, adding sugar to it made it even better for them.
Well, I'm looking both at the chat and the Q&A because there's questions in both. Please try to put your questions in the Q&A because the chat gets other things in it. But there was one somebody asked that I think is good to bring up now. It says, was there a nation of natives that was more valuable in guiding the Spaniards north from Central America? It was one group. I know that Tlaxcalans helped spread the sautillo, serape, the weaving traditions, because they had fought with the Spanish. Are there others that were particularly useful to the Spanish?
Yeah, the Tlaxcalans are definitely primary, very important there because of their help in the Spanish conquest. They were given a lot of, they didn't have to pay tribute, they were given tax breaks, they were given land grants. Apparently Santa Fe, New Mexico even had a Tlaxcalan barrio, neighborhood in the late colonial period. But to address the question about other indigenous peoples, as Spaniards made their way up north, they brought a lot of Nahuatl speakers, including Tlaxcalans, a lot of, the former Aztecs. They spoke Nahuatl. That's a language they still speak today. They brought a lot of indigenous Nahuatl speakers with them along this Camino Real up north, but also along the way, they would either cajole other indigenous peoples to join them. But one example of indigenous peoples along the Camino Real, when you get further north, way north of Mexico City, one strategy they used to get rid of Spaniards was to say, well, that Indian pueblo further north has silver flakes or it has gold flakes. So you really want to go up there. So ultimately, okay, that would pique the Spanish interest. And they would say, all right, we'll leave you alone, but you got to send a couple of your people with me. So different indigenous peoples along the way were added to the group.
So there's several questions about some of the sidearms of the Camino Real. And one is a very localized question wanting to know if Main Avenue in Tucson was part of a secondary Camino Real.
Well, we usually don't talk about Camino Real in Arizona, Sonora, but there were obviously very important routes. My colleague, Tom Sheridan, the cultural anthropologist, co-edited a book a couple of years ago on the Devil's Highway, kind of connecting like just west of Tucson, going what is now the US-Mexico border, hovering, huddling close what is now the US-Mexico border, that long, dry expanse of the Sonoran Desert going into what is now Yuma, Arizona, and the San Luis Valley in Mexicali and Baja California. That was a trail, of course, that was used. And then bringing folks, missionaries and supplies up from Sinaloa, they would hug the coast, right? Sinaloa is below Sonora. So there was a route there that connected Sinaloa to Sonora. So that was
they weren't really Camino Reals. They were just other
my understanding, they were not known as Camino Reales.
The Camino Real was part of the Spanish system and funded by the Spanish government, right?
Right, although a lot of portions of it, of course, follow Native American trail.
Right.
So it's not, but the area that from Sinaloa to Sonora, of course, there is support from the Spanish colonial infrastructure of sorts because they're always sending missionaries and soldiers that way. Mm-hmm. So that route, of course, is a long route that dates back to the so-called pre-Columbian era, when indigenous peoples from Western Mexico, there was some trade going on. You see that in turquoise and in shell, items like that making their way from Western Mexico up to Sonora. So, but not formal.
We have a couple more dealing with areas of the Camino. So there's one, let me find it. is the El Camino Real in California, basically from San Diego to San Francisco, contemporaneous to the Mexico City to the northern New Mexico route, or was it entirely different reasons and timing?
Well, it's the timing, it's still part of the Spanish colonial period, but it came later because it was the Franciscan missions that were established from San Diego, then Los Angeles, going all the way up to San Francisco. So they develop a Camino Real to connect all of those, 19 or 21 missions from San Diego to LA, to San Francisco. So they come in the 18th century. That Royal Road is more of a product of the 18th century as a way to sustain, develop, and defend those missions. So you see a lot of movement of missionaries, of soldiers, but also indigenous peoples making their way back and forth.
And which Camino ran through San Miguel de Allende?
That would be the main artery that we talked about, the so-called Silver Route. Now, if there was a truncated line connecting San Miguel, I'd have to go back and look, but it's certainly part of that longer line.
And another one about parts of the Camino. Is there another early Camino that went along the east coast of Mexico from, say, Veracruz up through South Texas, up to San Antonio and above? I visited several salt pans in South Texas referred to as Sal del Rey.
Yeah, I don't remember a Camino Real or even road that would hug the Gulf Coast all the way up to Mexico. There were Camino Reales that jutted off of the Camino Real I talked about today. That made. Let me see if I yeah. I think if you go back to my PowerPoint, I think I have a map there that shows an extension into Texas. So going into all the way the missions that the Franciscans,
right,
like the Alamo, for example.
But I mean, it brings up an important point that salt would have been a important trading item as well.
Right. Yeah. And like San Luis Potosí, one of my favorite cities in north central Mexico, it was an extension of what it didn't necessarily sit on the Camino Real, but an important extension of the Camino Real because of all of its importance in the mining enterprise, but also salt. So I had the privilege of actually going into an archive dedicated to salt projects in that area of San Luis Potosí. Wonderful, wonderful.
Right. And somebody else was wondering, do you know if citrus production traveled along the Camino Real? And we know Father Kino brought it to the Tucson area. Did the Spanish also bring citrus to other areas?
I mean, I can't answer specifically about citrus. Just in a general way, agricultural products made their way up and down the Camino Real. I assume, products that were not native to New Mexico when the Spanish arrived were brought up eventually along the Camino Real. But there was also indigenous trading going on even before Juan de Oñate arrived in Santa Fe. So, I think you can say that those trails and those roads played an important role, and citrus had to be one of the products.
Another person's curious about what kind of artifacts are still being found or are archaeological or by people who live near the Camino or are looking, or do you still think there are objects out there along the Camino?
Oh yeah, there's definitely, yeah. Now, Mexico, INA, that institute that I talked about, the National Institute of Anthropology and History, they're always, conducting archaeological excavations and historical surveys, and they uncover lots of stuff. So where you're really finding, though, artifacts would be not in the immediate vicinity of the road, but in all of those parajes and mining centers and towns that were found that sort of extended outward, and that, where settlement took place, that's where you would find new material cultural elements. And
would those be protected probably?
Well, yeah, I mean, Mexico definitely would bring them and bring to a museum. They would definitely go into a museum. So.
Yes, and Marilyn Guida mentioned that she put the link here, if you look in the Q&A, to the National Park Service website that shows you where there are 25 marked turnoff to segments of the Camino Real. I would assume that's in the 400 miles in the United States, since it's the national parks of the US.
Thank you for including that link.
Yeah. And let's see, this is a different question. Can you confirm what I learned from the Filipino American National Historical Society, that Manilean galleons stopped in the Moro Rock area of the California coast, and some Filipinos stayed in that area?
Unfortunately, I cannot confirm that, but I know where we could look to try to find that out. The Arizona State Museum back in the 90s published a series of documentary histories, translating from Spanish into English, all of these documents coming out of California. And if that's true, I could probably identify it somewhere in that documentary history, known as the Presidio and the militia on the far northern frontier of New Spain. So I can definitely take a look there. Who asked that question?
Let's see, I put it in the answered part. Let me find that. It was Marilyn Guida.
And, Lisa, you'll be able to give me a printout of this?
Yeah, we can provide, I think we can provide her email address to you. So.
Okay, or I can give it to you and you can send it to her, whatever's most appropriate. I don't want to infringe on anyone's privacy, but I could try to find an answer to that.
Okay, thank you. And then this one we've partially talked about, but I want to, there's a part that you can add to. Says, thank you, Michael, for the great presentation. Where textiles traded along the Camino Real, and we spoke about that.
Right.
Where saltillos harapes traded north into the southwest. Yes, and there's a you can see the past talk we had with Irvin and Lisa Trujillo from Chimayo. They addressed that in their talk. It's on our YouTube. And was the trading center Paquime, I'm not sure. Paquime, thank you. Paquime, right, along the route in pre-contact times.
Well, yeah, in the pre-Columbian times, Paquime, Casas Grandes, sometimes called, a very, very important center in northern Mexico, what we now call northern Mexico, the outer orbit, if you will, of Mesoamerica. So yeah, it definitely had its own network of trade routes, and it was a very influential center. Its influence extended beyond just that little area, not that big area of northern Chihuahua. So the answer is yes, but that would be something an archaeologist could give you more of a specific answer to.
Yeah, I'm just checking in the chat if I didn't, I don't think I, somebody was asking where's a good place to find a copy of the Casas paintings.
Well, the fastest way to do it is go online and just Google it. Right. Casas paintings, and you will come up with some beautiful imagery, but also links to works that you can read both in English and Spanish about the Casas paintings. But that's the best way. The images are very clear. Do you remember, Michael, when we put it in the exhibit? I think for the copy we got, we purchased the right to an image, a digital image of it from a Spanish archive, right? Wasn't it a Spanish museum? Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, that's right.
I can't remember which one right now, but we got it from Spain. So, well, that is, and I see somebody put in here about the Morro Bay. There's a link here if anybody wants to see it. There's a plaque, the text of the plaque. Somebody put in the chat. There's a lot of other really interesting comments from people in the chat that I hope people had a chance to read. And Darlene put in a link to the Devil's Highway if anybody's interested in that.
Thank you, Darlene.
I don't see any more questions for tonight. So I want to thank you so much, Michael, for this illuminating talk. I don't think a lot of people talk about the material culture and the trade along the Camino Real and the mingling. So thank you very, very much.